The worst moments are when I find that after hours of prayer, my heart is still dry, my spirit is still dry. Why I get no answer? Why I get no help?
Most people don't reject the truth because it is false. They reject it because it demands something from them. But what happens when the truth doesn't demand anything at all? What happens when it simply disappears? This is Father Lazarus El Anthony, not a preacher, not a theologian touring conferences, not a voice competing for attention in the noise, a man who walked away from everything and then walked away again. And in doing so, he became something far more unsettling than any sermon could ever be.
It was not that I made a choice for any particular saint or any particular place. It was that I turned away from a loveless life to a life of love. St. Mary offered me a mother love which I had immense need of. I was dying without love. And when she offered me her love, I took it, as a drowning man clutches at a straw. I came from a culture which was entirely metropolitan, entirely urban, entirely civilized, without any reference to the kind of extreme natural environments that monks usually inhabit.
He became a question with no answer. In the early 2000s, a handful of documentaries appeared. BBC's Extreme Pilgrim, The Last Anchorite, Desert Foreigners. They showed the world something it hadn't seen in centuries. A man living alone in the Egyptian desert. No electricity, no running water, no connection to the systems that define modern existence. Just stone, sand, silence, and prayer. Father Lazarus El Anthony, Australian-born, former atheist, university professor of literature and philosophy, a man who once stood in lecture halls dismantling Christianity with logic and precision. And then one day, he stopped. His mother died of cancer. And in the aftermath, something inside him broke open, not with answers, with questions he could no longer ignore. So he left. He left his marriage, his career, his country. He entered a monastic life in Australia, then Mount Athos in Greece, one of the most isolated Orthodox communities on earth. And still, it wasn't enough. So he went further, to Egypt, to the desert, where the first Christian hermits fled 17 centuries ago, to the place where Saint Anthony the Great, the father of all monks, once lived in absolute solitude. And there, Father Lazarus built a life that no longer fit into any modern category. He became a hermit, not in a metaphor way, but in fact. The documentaries were watched by tens of thousands. People saw him and something stirred. Not inspiration, exactly. Something harder to name. Because here was a man who had everything the modern world promises: education, recognition, comfort. And he looked at it all and said, "This is not me." Then he left it behind, not out of bitterness, not out of failure, out of clarity. And when people watched him speak, they heard something they hadn't heard in years. A voice with no agenda, no product to sell, no platform to build, just truth, spoken plainly. He talked about suffering not as something to escape, but as something to pass through. He talked about silence, not as emptiness, but as fullness. He talked about God not as a concept, but as a presence he lived inside of every single day. And people listened. They shared clips. They quoted him. They tried to find more. But then something strange happened. He began to disappear. At first, it was subtle. The interviews became harder to find. The newer footage stopped appearing. People would search for him online and find only fragments, old videos re-uploaded by strangers, blurry recordings from the 1990s, a few articles, but nothing recent. No social media, no website, no public statements. It was as if the internet which never forgets, had chosen to forget him. Or maybe he had chosen to be forgotten. Because Father Lazarus wasn't trying to build a following. He went deeper into the desert, deeper into silence, away from cameras, away from questions, away from the noise of a world that wanted to know him without ever truly following him. And in his absence, something strange began to happen. The questions didn't stop. They grew. Why would someone so articulate, so knowledgeable, so clearly awake, choose to vanish? Why would a man who spent years teaching philosophy at a university, a man who could speak 5 languages, who had read everything, who understood the human condition with brutal clarity, why would that man reject the very possibility of influence? Most people fight their entire lives to be heard. Father Lazarus fought to become silent, and that choice was worth more than any word he ever spoke. Because the modern world is built on visibility. You are what you broadcast. You are what you share. You are your profile, your platform, your presence. To disappear is to cease to exist. But Father Lazarus stepped outside of that logic entirely. He didn't cease to exist. He became more real, more solid, because he stopped performing. And when you stop performing, you stop needing the audience. And when you stop needing the audience, you stop being shaped by their expectations, their judgments, their hunger for content. You become free. There's an interview from the 1990s, rare footage, almost impossible to find now. In it, Father Lazarus sits in his small stone house in the Egyptian desert. He talks about the world he left behind, not with bitterness, not with judgment, just observation. He says, people think they want God, but what they really want is comfort. They want God to fit into their lives, to make things easier, to give them peace without cost. But God doesn't work that way. God asks you to die, not physically, but die to everything you think you are, everything you think you need. And most people hear that and turn around. This moment stayed with people because it wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a call to action. It was just the truth that most spiritual paths promise transformation. He didn't write about renunciation. He renounced. He didn't theorize about solitude. He became a hermit. He didn't talk about dying to the self. He lived it. And that's what made him so dangerous. Not because he condemned anyone, but because his life was proof that it could be done. Proof that the excuse of modern life makes it impossible was just that, an excuse. Proof that if you truly wanted to be free, you could. You just had to be willing to lose everything else. And most people aren't. They watched him from a distance. They admired him. They quoted him. They used his image as a symbol of something profound. But they didn't follow. Because following him would mean leaving the career, leaving the relationships that don't serve growth, leaving the comforts that dull the soul. And that's too much. Instead, people turned him into content. They clipped his interviews. They made videos about him. They discussed what he represented, but they didn't do what he did. And maybe he saw that. Maybe that's why he disappeared. Because the moment a hermit becomes famous, he stops being a hermit. The moment a man of silence becomes a voice people quote, the silence is broken. He withdrew. Not out of pride, not out of rejection, out of necessity. Because the path he walked can't be walked by proxy. It can't be understood through a screen. It has to be lived. Here's what people don't want to admit. Father Lazarus didn't disappear because the world rejected him. He disappeared because the world wanted him, but only as a symbol. They wanted the idea of a man who gave up everything, but they didn't want to give up anything themselves. They wanted the wisdom without the cost, the inspiration without the sacrifice, and he knew that. So he stopped giving them access, because wisdom isn't a transaction. Transformation isn't content, and a man who has truly let go doesn't need to be known. There's a concept in the Christian monastic tradition. It's called hesychasm, the practice of inner stillness, not meditation in the modern sense, not mindfulness, something deeper. The deliberate silencing of all mental noise, all distraction, all the endless chatter of the self, till what remains is nothing but presence, pure, unfiltered presence, no past, no future, no identity, just being. The Desert Fathers, who came before Father Lazarus, Saint Anthony, Saint Macarius, Saint Moses, they spent decades in the desert pursuing this. Not because they hated the world, but because they knew the world would never let them be still. The world demands performance. The world demands explanation. The world demands that you justify your existence by contributing, producing, being useful. But the hermit rejects that entire framework. He says, I don't need to be useful. I don't need to be understood. I don't need to matter to you. I only need to be present to God. And that, more than any doctrine, any theology, any argument, is the most radical statement a human being can make. Father Lazarus understood something most people never will. That knowledge, real knowledge, doesn't come from accumulation. It comes from subtraction. The more you remove, the more you see. The quieter you become, the more you hear. He didn't disappear from the internet because he had nothing left to say. He disappeared because he had already said everything that mattered, and the rest was noise. Where is he now? Somewhere in the Egyptian desert, in a cave perhaps, or a small stone cell near the Monastery of Saint Anthony, praying. Not for fame, not for influence, not even for understanding. Just praying, living the same way monks have lived for 17 centuries, waking before dawn, chanting psalms, eating simple food, enduring heat, cold, silence, solitude. And in that life, so completely foreign to everything modern, he is more free than almost anyone you will ever meet, because freedom isn't having more options. Freedom is no longer needing them. The world wanted him to stay visible, to keep teaching, to keep inspiring. But he knew something they didn't, that the moment you become a voice people depend on, you stop being free. You become a product, a resource, a symbol, and symbols are hollow. He chose substance over symbol, silence over speech, and in doing so, he became unfindable. Not because he's hiding, but because the place he went, you can't reach with a search bar. But what if we're just looking in the wrong place? We search for him online, but he's not there. He never was. He was always in the desert. And the desert doesn't upload. It doesn't care if you understand it or not. Maybe that's the real reason his absence unsettles people. Because in a world where everyone is fighting to be seen, he chose to vanish. And in doing so, he proved something terrifying. That you don't need the world to validate your existence. That you don't need followers, or fame, or even memory. That you can be completely unknown and completely whole. And if that's true, then everything we've been taught about meaning, purpose, and identity might be a lie.